Hours blurred into an unyielding vigil at Arlington. Retired SEAL James Duke Dean, a man carved from duty, endured. He finished his watch, unaware an unexpected gift was about to hurl him into a storm of disrespect that would redefine his evening. Sergeant James Duke Dean, a white retired Navy SEAL in his late 60s, stood his silent watch at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. For 12 hours, he'd been a living monument, his slightly hunched frame betraying nothing of the deep fatigue that gnawed at his muscles. His face, a roadmap of deep lines etched by wind and worry, bore a kind yet weathered expression. His thinning, salt and pepper hair was neatly combed. He wore a simple, dark, well-maintained jacket over a plain shirt, with faded but meticulously polished medals pinned to his chest. This attire, while modest, spoke volumes to those who knew. His mind, behind the calm, resolute gaze, drifted briefly to his old battle buddy, Lieutenant Commander Miller, now recuperating from a roadside bomb blast. Dean had volunteered for a double shift, stepping in without hesitation. A young boy, clutching a miniature American flag, waved enthusiastically from beyond the barrier, his mother trying in vain to get him to stop. Dean's eyes remained fixed forward, though a silent appreciation for the child's spirit warmed him. Most onlookers saw a quiet, ordinary old man. What they couldn't see was the extraordinary history: 2 decades in the elite SEAL teams, deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, a bullet scar on his shoulder from an ambush near Fallujah, and a Navy Cross carefully tucked away in his modest apartment. As the final moments of Dean's extended vigil ticked by, a tall, authoritative figure approached from the side path, General Sarah Reynolds, his former commanding officer, now a formidable white woman in her 50s, in a crisp Navy admiral's uniform, her expression a blend of sharp intelligence and profound respect. She waited patiently for Dean's relief to take his place, then offered a discreet, almost imperceptible nod. "Sergeant Dean," she said, her voice warm yet firm, "that was an exceptional demonstration of dedication. I know Miller appreciates it more than words can say." Dean simply offered a slight, acknowledging nod. "Sir, just doing my duty." General Reynolds reached into her uniform pocket, producing an elegant, cream-colored envelope with a discreet, embossed seal. "This isn't for duty, Sergeant. It's for you." She handed him a dinner voucher. "It's for the Presidential Club. Washington, D.C.'s finest steakhouse. Full service, all expenses covered." Dean's calm facade wavered slightly. The Presidential Club was legendary, fiercely exclusive, virtually impossible to get a reservation without a top-tier connection. "Mr. Richard Sullivan, the owner, is an old friend," General Reynolds explained, "served with him in the Gulf. He insists you accept." After a brief pause, Dean carefully tucked the voucher into his jacket. "Thank you, General. Unexpected, but truly appreciated." Dean emerged from his small apartment building into the twilight, ready for his unexpected evening. He'd considered wearing his old dress uniform, a cherished part of his past, but decided against it. Instead, he opted for his best, simple dark jacket and trousers, the same ones he'd worn for his cemetery vigil. This wasn't about showing off, it was about presenting himself with the same quiet dignity he carried into every mission. The faded medals on his chest were his only adornment, subtly reflecting the gravity of his service. On the metro, the usual rush-hour chaos seemed to part for him. A businessman immediately offered his seat, nodding respectfully. 2 young children stared openly from across the carriage, captivated by the quiet presence of the old soldier. "Are you a real soldier?" one whispered to her mother. Dean offered a small, gentle smile. "Yes, I am. Just finished my shift." An older white gentleman, a Korean War veteran himself, leaned forward. "Different uniform, same pride, son," he murmured. "Enjoy your evening." Dean exited at the White House station, the bustling city lights a stark contrast to the solemn quiet of the cemetery. The subtle nods of recognition affirmed his choice of attire. The Presidential Club stood as an understated monument to power and exclusivity in downtown D.C. Its facade, a tasteful blend of dark wood and polished brass, exuded quiet luxury. Two impeccably dressed doormen stood at attention, opening the imposing double doors for Dean. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over ivory linens and gleaming silverware. As Dean entered, several conversations momentarily hushed, then resumed in lowered tones. The hostess, Miranda, a slender, elegantly dressed young white woman with immaculate blonde hair pulled back in a chic chignon, looked up with a practiced smile that faltered as her eyes swept over Dean's simple jacket and the faded medals on his chest. Her smile tightened. "Good evening," she said, her tone carrying the slightest hint of doubt. "Do you have a reservation?" "Good evening," Dean replied with perfect courtesy, presenting the cream-colored envelope. Miranda took it with manicured fingers, her eyebrows subtly arching. "One moment, please," she murmured, already turning to whisper something to a man in a tailored suit nearby. This was Philip Harrington, the floor manager, a thin, sharply dressed white man, whose smile, when he approached Dean, was conspicuously absent. "We weren't expecting military personnel this evening," Philip stated, his voice coolly dismissive. "The voucher appears to be in order, though your attire is unconventional for our establishment." Despite several prime tables sitting conspicuously empty in the center of the lavish dining room, Miranda led Dean to a small, secluded table tucked behind a decorative column. It was the kind of table typically reserved for last-minute walk-ins or undesirable guests. Minutes stretched into a protracted wait before a waiter finally approached. This was Sebastian, a young, impeccably groomed white man, whose gaze seemed to drift past Dean's shoulder rather than meet his eyes. "Good evening," Sebastian said, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer to his next question. "Have you dined with us before?" "First time," Dean confirmed, his voice even. "I thought as much," Sebastian replied, a faint hint of condescension in his voice. "Our menu might be a bit sophisticated for first-time guests. Perhaps I could suggest something more accessible." Dean simply opened the menu. "I prefer to review the options myself." "Thank you." 20 minutes later, Sebastian returned with water, though Dean had observed him serving 3 other tables that had been seated after his arrival. "Have you decided?" Sebastian asked, notepad poised with theatrical readiness. "I'll start with the seared scallops," Dean replied. Sebastian's eyebrows rose slightly. "An excellent choice, though perhaps I should mention the scallops are priced at $75 for the starter portion. The voucher covers up to $300, but with wine pairings, you may wish to choose more economically." Dean met his gaze. "I understand the pricing." For the main course, he ordered the Chilean sea bass, highly recommended by General Reynolds. "The General has conventional tastes," Sebastian replied with a thin smile. "Perhaps you'd prefer something more adventurous." Every recommendation came with the same subtle, undermining condescension. Throughout the ordering process, manager Philip occasionally hovered nearby, exchanging knowing, derogatory glances with Sebastian. As Dean continued his meal, Sebastian approached to refill his wine glass. "Will someone be joining you this evening?" Sebastian asked, implying Dean's solitary state was somehow inappropriate. "No, just me." "How unusual. We rarely see solitary diners, especially in..." Sebastian's eyes swept over Dean's simple jacket and faded medals, dismissing them as common. "I assume you're directly from your post?" Sebastian continued, a mocking tone creeping into his voice. "Quite a commitment to remain dressed like that for tourists even after hours." "This isn't a costume," Dean corrected calmly, his voice low but carrying authority. "It's the attire of a retired United States Navy SEAL. This jacket, these medals, represent a lifetime of service." "Of course," Sebastian replied with a thin, theatrical smile. "How theatrical?" As Sebastian turned away, Dean overheard his hushed conversation with another server. "Thinks he's someone important. These military types should stay on base where they belong." Muffled laughter followed. Dean's appetizer arrived after nearly 40 minutes, an unusually long wait not shared by other diners. The scallops, while beautifully presented, were barely lukewarm, suggesting they had been left sitting before delivery. When Sebastian returned to clear the appetizer plate, he carried a bottle of deep red Bordeaux. Our sommelier recommends this with your main course, though perhaps it's more sophisticated than what you're accustomed to in the barracks. As Sebastian approached to refill Dean's glass, his hand tilted sharply. A stream of rich red wine cascaded directly onto Dean's simple dark jacket, staining the fabric right over his chest and medals. Time seemed to slow. Sebastian stepped back with an exaggerated display of shock, though the brief flash of satisfaction in his eyes betrayed the truth. Dean remained perfectly still, reaching for his napkin. "Accidents happen," he said quietly. Sebastian's lips curled slightly. "The wine will never come out of that outfit. Perhaps it's for the best. Might be time to replace it with something more contemporary, anyway." "This is not an outfit," Dean stated, his voice low but carrying the weight of decades of command. "This jacket, these medals, represent centuries of service and tradition. Men have died wearing this with honor." Sebastian's expression shifted to mock offense. "Sir, there's no need to become aggressive. It was a simple accident. The uniform of the United States military deserves respect," Dean continued, rising slowly to his feet, his gaze unwavering. "As do those who earn the right to wear it." Manager Philip materialized beside the table. "Is there a problem here?" "Your server deliberately spilled wine on my jacket," Dean stated calmly, then insulted both the symbols of service and by extension, the institution it represents. "I did nothing of the sort." Sebastian protested, his voice rising. "It was an accident, and now he's becoming hostile." "I'm afraid we can't have disruptions in our dining room," Philip said, his tone hardening. "Our guests expect a certain atmosphere. The only disruption has been the systematic disrespect shown since my arrival," Dean countered, his voice steady. "Perhaps establishments like ours aren't suitable for military personnel. There are many fine pubs that might be more appropriate for your station." "I think it would be best if you departed now," Philip stated, no longer bothering with pretense. "We'll consider the voucher used, of course." Dean looked at the wine stain spreading across his jacket. With the same dignity that had carried him through countless missions and countless ceremonial duties, he placed his napkin beside his half-eaten meal. "Very well," he said quietly, meeting Philip's gaze directly. "But General Reynolds will hear of this." "I'm sure we'll survive the General's disappointment," Philip replied dismissively. "Sebastian, please show our guest to the door." With perfect military bearing, Dean walked toward the exit. At the door, Sebastian couldn't resist one final barb. "Perhaps next time, come in proper civilian attire. That jacket is a bit much for serious dining." At home, Dean carefully treated the wine stain on his dark jacket, using an old regimental trick of cold water and salt. After hanging it to dry, he found little in his refrigerator to satisfy his hunger after the long day. The irony wasn't lost on him. Having been presented with a voucher for one of DC's finest restaurants, he was ending his evening hungry in a sparsely stocked apartment. The next morning at Arlington, the changing ceremony proceeded with typical precision. Dean took his position, his face betraying nothing of the previous evening's humiliation. General Reynolds observed from her usual position. When duties transitioned, General Reynolds approached. "Sergeant Dean," she called, her voice serious. "At ease. You look like you've had insufficient rest. Was yesterday's double shift too taxing?" "No, General. I'm perfectly capable of performing my duties." "And how was your dinner at the Presidential Club? Did you take my recommendation for the Chilean sea base?" "The food was excellent, General," Dean answered carefully. "Thank you for the voucher." General Reynolds' gaze dropped to Dean's jacket, her expression hardening as she noticed the wine stain. "What's this?" "A small accident with wine, General. Nothing significant." Though in my experience, wine stains on attire often have stories attached to them. Stories worth hearing. Dean related the previous evening's events, his account precise and factual. Throughout his report, General Reynolds' expression darkened progressively. "They called your jacket an outfit?" General Reynolds' voice was dangerously quiet when Dean finished. "Yes, General. Multiple times." "This isn't personal, Sergeant Dean," General Reynolds said, using his rank, a rarity that emphasized the seriousness of the situation. "When they disrespected you in that jacket, they disrespected every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who has ever worn the uniform. They disrespected the Pentagon and the nation itself." General Reynolds strode to her office, closing the door firmly behind her. Through the frosted glass, Dean could see the general's silhouette as she picked up her phone. Though the words were muffled, the controlled anger in General Reynolds' tone carried clearly. Several minutes later, General Reynolds emerged with grim satisfaction. "Richard Sullivan and I served together for 22 years, General Reynolds explained. "He's absolutely livid about your treatment. He's been away in Colorado, leaving his establishment in the hands of this Philip person. A decision he now deeply regrets. Sullivan will be at his restaurant within the hour. He's requested that we join him this evening at 8. He intends to address this situation personally and wants you there, Sergeant." "General, that's not necessary." "It is absolutely necessary," General Reynolds stated firmly. "This isn't about a free meal or wounded pride. It's about respect for what we represent. Will you join me?" "Yes, General." "Good. I'll meet you at the main entrance at 7:30. Formal attire, of course. Wear your best, Sergeant. All your ribbons." At precisely 7:30 that evening, Dean arrived at the Arlington gates in his best dark suit, now meticulously cleaned, and all his ribbons and medals gleaming. General Reynolds appeared moments later, and a black armored SUV pulled up to collect them. "Richard Sullivan is a good man," General Reynolds said during the journey. "What happened last night was a betrayal of his values as much as an insult to you and everyone who serves." As they arrived at the Presidential Club, Dean noticed the entire front-of-house staff lined up at the entrance like an honor guard. At their center stood a distinguished silver-haired gentleman, Mr. Sullivan himself. General Reynolds, Sergeant Dean, Mr. Sullivan greeted them, his voice deep with sincerity, his gaze unwavering. "Welcome to the Presidential Club." Inside, the restaurant's patrons were dressed more formally than the previous evening, and a military band was playing a solemn rendition of "The Stars and Stripes Forever." Mr. Sullivan led them to the best table in the house. "Before we begin," Mr. Sullivan said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent dining room, "there are some who need to address you directly." Miranda, the hostess, approached first, her face pale. "Sergeant Dean, I want to apologize for my part in your treatment last night. My behavior was inexcusable and disrespectful." Next came Philip, no longer carrying his smug authority. "Sergeant Dean, General Reynolds, I failed in my responsibilities last night in the most fundamental way. The disrespect shown to you reflects a failure of character on my part." Finally, Sebastian approached, his earlier condescension replaced by genuine remorse. "Sergeant, my behavior was deliberately disrespectful and resulted in damage to your jacket. There is no excuse for what I did. I wish to offer my sincere apology." Dean studied the three of them, aware that the entire restaurant had fallen silent, every eye fixed on the scene. With measured control, he nodded once. "Apologies accepted," he said simply, his dignity and forgiveness as evident as it had been in enduring their disrespect. Mr. Sullivan stepped forward again. "I have offered these individuals the opportunity to resign rather than face immediate termination. That decision, however, ultimately rests with you, Sergeant." "Mr. Sullivan," Dean began, his voice calm, "I believe the apologies offered appear genuine. Perhaps this incident can serve as an opportunity for growth rather than merely punishment." Mr. Sullivan raised an eyebrow, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "You're more merciful than many would be in your position, Sergeant. The uniform represents something greater than personal grievances, Dean replied, his gaze unwavering. Holding on to resentment serves neither them nor the values we uphold. As Mr. Sullivan departed to oversee the kitchen, Sebastian, now assigned as their waiter under close supervision, approached with newfound humility, his movements precise and respectful. As the meal progressed, Mr. Sullivan shared stories of his military service alongside General Reynolds. "You know, Sergeant Dean, I was in uniform myself for 22 years before opening this restaurant," Mr. Sullivan confided. "Army Special Forces. Served alongside Sarah in the Gulf. This restaurant grew from my second passion, but I've never forgotten where I came from. Which is why your treatment last night was particularly unacceptable." By the meal's conclusion, what had begun as a formal apology had evolved into a genuine exchange of mutual respect. Mr. Sullivan raised his glass for a final toast. To service in all its forms, he proposed, whether in combat, in quiet vigil, or yes, even in restaurants. When done with pride and respect, all service has dignity. As they prepared to leave, several other diners approached to express their respect. One elderly gentleman identified himself as a Marine veteran and shook Dean's hand firmly. "The uniform still matters to those of us who understand what it represents," he said quietly. Outside, Dean paused to look back at the restaurant. "Not quite how I expected this evening to unfold, General," he admitted. "Sometimes respect must be taught rather than assumed," General Reynolds replied. "But once learned, it's rarely forgotten." As they drove back toward Arlington, Dean reflected on the transformation he'd witnessed. The same restaurant that had humiliated him 24 hours earlier had become the setting for one of the most respectful evenings of his career. The wine stain would eventually fade from his jacket, but the lesson of the experience would remain, a reminder that dignity comes not from how others treat you, but from how you conduct yourself when faced with disrespect. And in that, Sergeant James Duke Dean had proven himself every bit the guardian his silent service proclaimed him to be. Have you ever been judged unfairly based on your appearance or a perceived social status? How did you handle it? It's easy to respond to disrespect with anger, but Sergeant Dean showed that sometimes dignity and restraint can be more powerful than retaliation. What would you have done in Dean's position? Demanded termination for those who disrespected you, or granted the second chance he offered? Your perspective might reveal more about your character than you realize. If this story touched you, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our daily stories of honor and resilience. Share this video with someone who appreciates stories about dignity, respect, and the true meaning of service. Our previous videos are appearing on your screen right now. Why not check them out next? We'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another brand new story you won't want to miss.